Welcome to the Honest Brothers channel. Today I'm going to show you how I made this circle cutting jig for my router. I started this project out like most of my projects start, by ripping pieces to width on the table saw. This is 1/4 inch Baltic birch plywood that existed as cut-off scraps before this project. If you've ever seen or read The Hobbit, you'll know that woodworkers and scraps are like dwarves and gold. We like to hoard the scraps, sometimes to the level of insanity. But instead of hoarding gold in mountains, they just usually hoard it in places called lumber mills. After I got my 2 pieces of 1/4 inch Baltic birch cut to width, I picked up these pieces of hardware from the hardware store. This is a threaded rod, a wing nut, a washer, and a funny looking threaded nut that has a built-in washer on it. I think you could have replaced the funny looking nut and washer with a standard nut and washer, and I might do that eventually. These pieces act as the center of the circle and the pivot point for the jig to turn around. In order for these pieces to stay stationary, I needed to give the threaded rod a point on the end so it will stick down in whatever piece of wood I'm trying to cut a circle out of. Once I had that point sharpened, I needed to measure the width of the little nut thingy with the built-on washer so that I could cut a recess in the 2 Baltic birch plywood pieces that I cut earlier. Now this recess will house the nut, and here's me doing some math to try to figure out exactly where I needed to set the table saw up to cut a slot so the nut can move back and forth and make the circle cutting jig adjustable. Once I had that set on the table saw, I could go ahead and lower the blade and then get a scrap 2x4 to place along the fence and clamp on. This will hold the 1/4 inch plywood down while the blade is pushed up through the wood with the height adjustment on the table saw. I did this so that the threaded rod could stick through the plywood and the nut would have a place to sit and not intrude on the point that is at the end of the threaded rod. If that's super confusing, hang with me. I'll show you how it all works together at the end of the video. But for now, here is me installing the threaded rod, the nut, the wing nut, and the washer, and showing you that it slides back and forth down in this recess that I just cut out. The next step was for me to glue these pieces together so that they end up being one solid piece. And because of that fancy-dancy back of plywood math that I did earlier, I knew that both of these pieces should have that cut directly in the center. Next, I removed the plate off the bottom of my plunging router base. I wanted to use a plunging router base instead of a fixed router base so that I could choose the amount of material that I removed at once. Once I had the plate off, I marked the holes on the plate so that I could attach the router to the circle cutting jig. But in order to drill holes, I needed to use my handy dandy automatic drill press vise. I have a build video of this that I'll link here. I use the drill bit with the taper built into it so that the screws on the bottom will have a place to be recessed into the bottom of the circle cutting jig. At this point, there wasn't really anything left for me to do other than drill a hole for the router bit to go through. Once I had the hole drilled, I went back over to the router, mounted the jig on the router, and then got to cutting a beautiful, perfect circle. Thanks for watching, Honest Brothers. Catch you next time.